Welcome everybody to Options Trading, brought to you by Alpha Traders. This is going to be a video going over the glossary of options terminology. We're about halfway through the 9-video series, and now it's time to talk about some terms, words, or phrases that you're going to come across in the options market that you don't necessarily ever hear about in other markets. Again, we're right in the middle here, the glossary of options terminology. Next, we will be talking about the bread and butter, which is calls and puts. So one may think that if they trade stocks or the regular stock market, then they already know everything there is to know about trading other markets. That is just simply not the case. Anybody that walks through the doors of Forex and options or futures would have you thinking very, very differently. So in order to learn options market and be able to trade it properly, there are some terms that you're going to need to familiarize yourself with so that you understand what other traders are talking about when they mention things like ITM or OTM or ATM, and we're going to get into all of that right now. So strap in. This one may be a little bit longer than the other videos, but there are some major terms that we need to discuss, so let's get to it. First and foremost, call option. So a call option is a type of option which grants the holder the right, but not the obligation, to buy the relevant underlying security at an agreed strike price. To put it very simply for you, call options are generally when you expect the price of the underlying asset to go up. So that's more or less your long. Right? The opposite of that would be your short or your put option. This is when you expect the price to go down. You expect the direction to go down. Definition for put option: a type of option which grants the holder the right, but not the obligation, to sell the relevant underlying security at an agreed strike price. For example, if you have a put option on, let's say, it doesn't matter, anything. Let's just say you got a put option on Activision. And let's say that put option is at $80. So if price is currently at 84 and it eventually makes its way to 80 and now it's at $79, you are for sure at that point in profit. Whereas if you were going the other way, you would want a call option. Let's say your price is currently at 84. You expect price to go up to 87. You can get an in-the-money call option at 84 or an out-of-the-money call option at 88. And we'll talk about those right now. ATM, ITM, OTM, what are they? What do they mean? ATM, you're not going to hear as often because of the nature of options and the nature of the stock market itself. Things are generally moving, and they're moving fairly quickly for the most part. So you don't always have something at the money, but ATM stands for at the money. This is an option where the price of the underlying security is the same as the strike price. And this essentially means that there's no leverage given either way. There's not a winning side for longs, not a winning side for shorts. You're right there. You're right in the middle. You're at the money. ITM, in the money. So this is an option where the price of the underlying security is in a favorable position relative to the strike price for the holder, meaning it has intrinsic value. For example, let's go back to AMD. And AMD is sitting at $50. If I have a call option for AMD, anything under $50 and I'm in the money, meaning if I were to exercise my $45 call option, I can now buy 100 stocks at $45 a piece instead of the going rate or current market rate of $50 a piece. That would be considered in the money. It has intrinsic value. OTM is just the opposite. This is out the money. So an option where the price of the underlying security is in an unfavorable position relative to the strike price for the holder, meaning that it has no intrinsic value. So clearly this one would say, okay, AMD is at 50. I have a call option at $55. AMD is cheaper for me to just buy the stock. I can just buy 100. I don't need the option to do that. I could just buy 100 shares of AMD at $50. The very fact that we haven't reached $55 yet means that that call option is expected to go higher and higher and higher, where 55 will now become a deal. If 55 never becomes a deal, if we never reach 55, it will end up expiring worthless. So we just talked about intrinsic value. Now let's define intrinsic value. This is the component of a price that's affected by the profit that is effectively built into the contract. So when it's in the money, only when it's in the money, right? The amount of theoretical profit that could be realized by exercising the option. So again, this goes back to the reason why options are attractive and the reason why people trade options to begin with. You can have an option go up and increase in value at an exponential rate compared to what the actual stock itself is doing. Remember that everything that happens inside of a stock is essentially multiplied by 100. So when you do finally have an option and it's in intrinsic value, it has intrinsic value to it, it actually is worth something. It's always worth something so long as it's considered in the money. And that's when you do build your intrinsic value, when you're in the money. If you're out of the money, you do not have any intrinsic value on that option. Now, time decay. This is something very unique to options as opposed to standard stocks. This is the process by which the extrinsic value diminishes as the expiration date of the option gets closer. So picture yourself betting on a horse race. You have all these bets that can go on and on and on and on, hours, days, weeks, months ahead of time before the race ever starts. And in that time, everybody sort of has the same risk. Everybody sort of has the same gamble. Horse 1 could win, horse 5 could win, horse 12 could win, whatever the case may be. But let's say you're halfway around the track. Well, now you have a fairly clear idea of who's going to lose and a potential chance of who's going to win. A basket of, let's say, 3 to 5 horses that are potentially still winning. As you round the bend to the last turn, now you have a much better idea on who is going to lose and who's going to win. Maybe you can even narrow that down to 1 as a landslide, or maybe 2. Picture that as time decay. When you have an options, you have an expiration date on it. Consider your expiration date being the finish line of the race. As you get closer and closer and closer and closer to that time, that finish line, if you're the horse that's dead last, the chances of you actually becoming the winner are getting worse by the second. So that's your time decay. As the option gets closer and closer and closer to expiration, the further and further and further away you are from at the money or from gaining intrinsic value, the more rapidly you're going to lose value on that options. All right, now premium. This is a term that can be used to describe the whole price of an option or the extrinsic value of an option. So essentially, your premium, going back to one of our history lessons when we talked about the brief history of options and sales, extrinsic value, this is the premium that he charged for the olive presses. So in other words, he covered his costs, he got his money back, but he had value on top of that. And that value was based off of a number of different criteria. For his case, mostly demand and the amount of different farmers or whatever the case may be who had the olives, who needed the presses. So premium, it describes the whole price of the option. If an option is selling for $2, really that's $2 times 100, that becomes $200 in order for you to have that option. So if it has extrinsic value, meaning that the entire options itself is going to cost $200 and you're not exactly in the money at that point, there has to be a value associated with this somehow. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to buy any options. Chain. These are tables that are used to show various information related to specific options. You may hear the term options chain, you may hear option table, you may hear option charts. They all necessarily mean the same thing. When we talk about legs, and we'll talk about that in a few slides from here, chains can also be used in the same terminology, discussing or describing multiple options, more of like an advanced option strategy, and they could call that an options chain. Other traders will use chain as the tables as you pull up in an exchange and you want to see the options table. They'll call it an options chain. But just so you understand, chain can be referred a few different ways, but a chain is essentially all of your options orders. These are all of your strikes. These are all of your calls and puts, the value that they're at the moment for bids and asks, the deltas in betweens, and then you can figure out from there how to move around the table to get different strike rates and then to get different expiration dates. All right, exercise. The process by which the holder of a contract uses their right under the terms of that contract to either buy or sell the relevant underlying security at the stated strike price. So that sounds like a whole bunch of words. Essentially, exercise just really means that you're going to go through with the option. You bought an option to buy 100 stocks of AMD at a price of $42, and you're going to do it. You're going to buy those options, right? You're not going to buy those options. You're going to exercise that option and buy that stock, buy 100 stocks of AMD at that strike price. Expiration date. The date on which the contract expires, really nothing crazy about that, and it effectively ceases to exist. Options must be exercised on or before this date, or they will expire worthless. Now, there is a caveat to that. For options that expire, we have weekly options, we have quarterly options, and depending on the market, you could have partial daily options, something like SPY or S&P 500. You can have options that go every 2 days, every 3 days. But anyway, to make a long story short, on a Friday, they don't necessarily expire until the end of the next day, meaning Saturday really at midnight. So depending on your broker, if you wanted to exercise that option, you actually can. So that is something that you need to understand. By and large, for the most part, if you're just buying and selling calls and puts, the expiration date is exactly what you need to know for that 4 o'clock period, right? From 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., just so you can get out of the market and be done with it. You don't have to hold it overnight, or you don't have to let it expire. Okay, the Greeks. This is a series of values that can be used to measure the sensitivity of an option to the changes in the market conditions and the theoretical changes in the price of an option caused by specific factors, such as the price of the underlying security, volatility, time left until expiry. So we're going to talk about the Greeks very quickly. To really get into the Greeks is well beyond the scope of this entire series. However, you do need to be aware of what they are, and then you can choose to dive into them much deeper to your heart's content. So the Greeks, there are 5 Greeks. These are data sets that options traders use in order to understand how that options contract is moving and whether it's favorable for them to even get into a position or not. So delta is how much an options price is expected to change, while gamma is actually the rate of change of delta. Theta is time decay, as we discussed before, time decay. Vega is sensitivity to volatility, while rho is sensitivity to interest rates. These all have their place as far as data metrics are concerned in the options world, in the options market. Not all option traders use the Greeks. However, I think all option traders, especially new option traders, should really at least spend a few hours, spend a few days, and understand them to at least know what they are, and then decide for yourself whether that's something that you want to build into your strategy. Okay, leg, like we mentioned earlier about chains, When an options position is made up of a combination of multiple positions, each of the individual positions is known as a leg. A very common strategy for options traders is called an iron condor. This is where you're going to have multiple options, right? Where you're actually going to have 4 contracts that you're going to be buying and selling in order to build that one strategy. Each one of those would be considered a leg. That's one position of the 4 positions. So it's good to know that those are considered legs. If you do hear other traders talking about leg 1, leg 2, leg 3, leg 4, that is what they're referring to. Rolling, a trading technique used to close an existing position and then open a similar one at the same time with slightly different terms. By and large, what this means is you're gaining expiration time. What some traders will do is they'll run out of time on that particular contract, and let's say they had it to close in November. Now they want it to close in December, but they want to maintain the same strike rate. You can also do it the other way, where you're rolling the strike rate. You're going to push it up or you're going to push it down, but you do want to change the date on that. Let's say you have it expiring in January of 2021, but now you want to make it December of 2020. Spread. So spread is a position that's created by buying and or selling different contracts on the same underlying security to combine multiple positions into one effective position. So you could do credit spreads, you could do debit spreads, you could do vertical spreads, you can do calendar spreads. I mean, there's a lot of different spreads out there. There's a lot of different ways to trade options. In the next video, we are going to talk about just the bread and butter, calls and puts. However, there are many different strategies, and spread, you almost want to say, is a strategy, or at least an umbrella strategy. Spreads themselves, you can have vertical spreads, or you can have calendar spreads. You can also have spreads that involve buying and selling within the same strategy, similar to something like an iron condor. So there's a lot of different things you could do with spreads. Spreads more of just a global umbrella term, but you'll come across spreads all the time. Now, not written in here, but also another time where you're going to hear spread is potentially what's really the delta, but the differential between your bid and ask. In typical trading, we use spreads all the time, and spread would be, this asset is current or last traded price was $50, but you have a bid and ask that's 50 cents in either direction, right? That would be your spread. Okay, strike price. The price specified in a contract at which the holder of the contract can exercise their option. That should be relatively straightforward. And then writing an option. The process of effectively creating new contracts to sell. So we haven't gotten into writing options yet. That is actually fairly advanced in the options world. There are plenty of options traders that have traded for 5, 10, 15 years, and they've never written an option in their life. But I did want to throw it in there because it is kind of important to understand where options even come from. They don't just come off the shelf and all of a sudden you can just buy options. That's not how it works. Somebody actually has to write that option, make it available. And at that point, they are responsible, right? They do have an obligation to then honor that contract if it's exercised. So there are some risks associated with writing options. All right, but that essentially wraps it up for the glossary of options terminology. I know that was a lot to cover. If you need to watch this a few times, that's fine. But, go at it at your own pace. Just make sure you're familiar with the terminology because it is different from your standard straight up traditional stock trading. Those terms you are going to come across, they are fairly common. And if you do want to get into options trading, you are going to need to know what they are. All right, so that wraps it up for this video. The next one we will talk about bread and butter, and that would be calls and puts.